computer and then I go. Vera, are you there?
You know any good jokes?
No.
Having tried to get you all here, she's that one. I'm going to introduce her. Okay, Vera, I'm going to introduce you and then we're going to pass over to you. Can you hear us all right? Can you hear us? Yeah, okay. So Dame Vera Baird, QC, has served as the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales since May 2019. She served as Solicitor General for England and Wales from 2007 to 2010 and as Police and Crime Commissioner for Northumbria Police from November 2012 to June 2019. Dame Vera placed society's addressing of domestic and sexual violence at the core of her Police and Crime Commissioner position. And with the two other North East region PCCs, she launched the first ever regional violence against women strategy, women and girls strategies in November 2013. Dame Vera is the author of books on rape, female murders, and women's experiences in court. She was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2017 in the New Year's Honours for services to women and equality. Well, I'm proud to tell you that she is a seroptimist. And I'm very proud to tell you that she is my friend. So I don't know of anyone better placed to talk to us today about shifting attitudes in this crucial part of our lives. Vera.
Thanks very much indeed for that very friendly introduction. I hope you can all hear me okay. Yes? Yes? Splendid. So the very day that Sabina Nessa was killed in a park in South London, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary produced a report about how the police deal with violence against women and girls. It described an epidemic of violent and abusive offending against women and girls. The first section of my talk to you is about policing because they are very key, but more will follow. If you can engage with your local police to express some of the concerns I raise, you may help to bring change. A big problem is, of course, there are 43 police forces, 43 chief constables, 40 police and crime commissioners, and there are real patches of good practice, but they are isolated and they don't spread because all of these people want to be, quite understandably, king in their own castle, queen in their own castle, and they want to do things their own way. The Inspectors of Constabulary report described 50% of women feeling unsafe in public spaces. 2/3 of women between the ages of 16 and 34 having been harassed on the street by men. The figures for flashing were epic. So women stay at home where it's safe. 1.6 million women a year suffer from domestic abuse, 96% of it by men, and 2 women a week are killed in that way. A fraction of domestic abuse cases which occur are reported, and 3/4 of all reports of domestic abuse that do go to the police are binned, to put it in a non-technical way, by the police long before they get to the charging stage. In 2019-20, 57,000 rapes were reported to police. Again, a fraction of those that occur, but there has been a collapse in prosecution of rape, frankly led by the CPS, but which the police have been complicit in. So remember, 57,000 reports to the police, 1,109 people convicted of rape, the lowest ever in our history. The CPS did lead that collapse with a decision to favour conviction rates over prosecutions. This is to say, if you prosecute 20 cases and you get 15, that's a conviction rate of 75%. That's not at all bad. But if you prosecute 10 rock solid certainties and you get 9, that's a conviction rate of 90%, and that's great. Unfortunately, you've only convicted 9 and you could only ever have convicted 10, whereas before we were convicting 15 and could have convicted all 20. putting conviction rate first, which is what their reputation wraps around, has cut enormously the volume of people who are brought to court, prosecuted and convicted. I dwell on rape because of the 180,000, mostly women survivors who responded to the government's consultation on its violence against women and girls strategy. Many, many, many said, why would we report harassment and flashing? They don't even prosecute rape. So these police inspectors asked the 4 forces they chose as typical to find the 10 men most dangerous to women in their force. They did, but 34 of those 40 men had never been identified as a risk to women before. It was only done because the inspectors told them to do. So the police regularly manage burglars, they regularly manage robbers, they manage terrorist risks in the community. There was no sense here that they had even identified, let alone taken steps to manage men who they acknowledge when pressed are a danger to women. 3/4 of the men in these forces picked as typical who broke court orders that were in place to protect women, saw absolutely no consequences of any kind at all, even though a breach of such an order is often a crime, and it certainly is another episode of some kind of abuse. So there really was no sense of focus on this work, no status attached to this work, no central direction or central resourcing to bring everybody up to best practice. But violence against women and girls kills a woman every 3 days, far more than the people killed in terrorism, but dealt with in a fundamentally different way, because many, 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 many lives are saved by the way the police deal with terrorism. But the same has not so far gone for this. So I attended this morning a summit of police, and I asked them, as Victims Commissioner, why don't the police tackle violence against women and girls as they tackle other things? And is the real question, and I have to leave it hanging in the air since obviously I didn't get an answer, is the real question, why won't the police tackle violence against women and girls? I spoke to a senior police officer recently, a woman, who said to me, if there's a call for burglary, the police will run. If it's a domestic abuse one, they don't go there so fast. So I asked the police present, why don't you run when it's domestic violence? The criminal justice system is very important. You know, it isn't good, but it's imperative to make the point that the state disagrees with this behavior. But society has got to stop blaming women for the crimes done against us. There has been an academic study called Project Sateria. It's a weird name, but it was in Avon and Somerset Police who had the courage to open their doors and say, this is how we investigate rape. How are we doing? It was a deep dive from academics, and they found that Avon and Somerset Police, and let me just pause to say there has been an inspection of other forces in similar terms, and it isn't just Avon and Somerset, but there in that police force, they were told that they didn't have a rape investigation squad. They had a complainant credibility investigation squad for rape cases. So the report spoke of many complainants who'd had their entire phones and their devices downloaded and searched, their medical records from birth scrutinized, their school reports, their social services documents sieved through for material which might have an impact on their credibility as rape complainants. And in many of those cases, the man against whom rape was alleged had never even been approached. There were more than one case in which the man in question had admitted rape to the victim on WhatsApp, but was never arrested. The police did not get beyond the credibility of the complainant. Clearly, that has to change. One thing that won't change until it's changed internally is the police attitude. There are real problems about violence against women and girls in the police themselves, as we've seen all too uncomfortably recently with the Sarah Everard case. But what happens if there's a report to the police of domestic abuse by an officer? The force puts them on light duties because they're worried that their marriage might be breaking down and they need to be looked after. Now, that's fine for an employer, but it's not much comfort for the partner who has no choice but to complain to the same force that he works for, that her complaint of him beating her up gives him easier work and more opportunity to be at home. And there are no prosecutions. There are very, very few prosecutions of police officers for abuse. Somewhere between bonding and belonging seems either to make other police protective or just unable to believe a complaint against a fellow officer. The answer to that is pretty simple, but it is resisted. It just has to go to another force, doesn't it? You can't have somebody's colleagues investigating them. It has to go to Durham if it's in Northumbria, and it has to go to whatever the neighbour to Avon and Somerset is. And that's a very simple step, which, you know, I've been at this summit this morning, and there were some brand new figures produced by another speaker about confidence in policing. And you won't be shocked to hear, but it nonetheless is shocking to know that confidence in police amongst women has fallen by a half since the Sarah Everard case happened. They will not get that back if they don't clear their own problems out. Why would I go to the police for help about domestic abuse or sexual assault if I might come across an officer who's guilty of the same against his own partner, because they don't chase them out? Let's step them, because it's hugely important, but the criminal justice system, of course, isn't all of it. And in the world outside that, as in that world, there is a question of culture. There is something, and you help me put the right finger on it, with men, of a camaraderie, a fellow feeling, a sharing of masculinity, a component of which is being sexually attracted, and I suppose by inference sexually attractive to women, which at worst can be permissive. Males who don't discourage cheap misogynistic remarks, sexual comments, talking of women like objects whose predominant point is their sexuality and not their humanity. People who don't discourage men from that behavior encourage dangerous men to think that they have the full support of their gender to exercise their male entitlement over these female objects as and how they wish. Let me pause here before I go back to my main theme to say I meet with sexual assault victim services every 2 weeks, and half of these services are for men. They support men. They work extremely well with me and with the female sector, and those male victim support organizations agree that the cause of sexual assault on women and on men is violent men. It is violent men in both cases. So for both sexes, we can't encourage them. I launched a bystander project at Exeter Football Club with the university who designed it. They trained volunteers at all levels of football to sensitize them to misogynistic remarks. And when spoken, they simply said that wasn't appropriate and it should stop. That was their task. To their surprise, even in the locker room atmosphere around football, the majority of men present did not acknowledge and support the misogynistic remark, but supported instead the intervention by the bystander. Statistically, that came across very loud and clear. So it is not a right assumption that this kind of behavior is kind of natural, unchangeable male culture. It's plain that it isn't. And as I'm sure you're very well aware, culture can change. Consider drink driving. When I was a young woman, if somebody was caught drink driving who, people knew, a neighbor, the question was, why are the police not out catching criminals instead of interfering with us? Now, I think people would take the keys of somebody, however friendly they were, away if they thought they were going to drive when they'd had too much to drink, because it's dangerous and it kills, a bit like violence against women does. And smoking is another thing about which our attitudes have fundamentally changed. But drink driving required and received a change of national culture. It took about £20 million and consistent campaigning over at least the last 2 decades. And it took high skills and high endeavour to bring that change on a scale that only government can do. But it did work. Now, I accept readily that drink driving wasn't a profound long-term cultural inheritance like gender roles are. There is a very, realistic reason why male superiority started, left over from the time, surely, when only men could do the manual labour that kept families afloat, and women very sensibly gave them a bit of the best food that the family could afford to keep working and sacrificed themselves. I suspect that areas like the Northeast, where I've lived a lot of my life, where there were traditional industries like mining that required male strength, even though the need for that strength has gone, still may have more polarized sexual roles than in other places. And they may even be more violence against women and girls in places like that, though I am really not sure about that. But I know when I was a member of parliament, we had a steelworks in my constituency, and I went to the steelworks actually expecting to see, roaring flames and bare-chested men with hammers and stuff like that. Well, actually, the way the steelworks ran was by people pushing buttons and tweaking computers. There wasn't a woman in sight. It had been a male-only territory. The need for that had disappeared, but it still was. Culture long outlasts its purpose. And so I don't think, that by trying to tackle this culture, we are in any way worrying about, damaging our history. It is a deeper culture change than drink driving. But drink driving, which was really very well set up the way it was, is a clue that a consistent, long-term, well-financed change might be achievable. We need, of course, leadership to change that culture. And I believe this government does actually want to lead. It is not my political colour, but I work with them. And I do think they think the moment has come. We need leadership from the criminal justice system, parts of which do now see that confidence has collapsed and they must lead. We need input from protective, preventive mechanisms like education, so we can bring up young people with a better outlook. But remember, when young people go out and mix with their elders, the dominant culture recurs, and particularly the young aspire to be like the slightly older. So education has to be good, but it is vital. There needs to be a focus on perpetrators when they're seen by the public authorities, when they're seen by medical practitioners, who sometimes see women going into A&E 3 or 4 times with boot marks on their face and don't feel that they should ask questions or pass on that information and can't speak to her if the perpetrator is with them. Local government has to acknowledge that somebody who leaves home through domestic abuse isn't voluntarily homeless and needs help. The family courts need to see that it isn't possible to have a domestic abuse perpetrator who's a good parent, because domestic abuse victimizes the children who live in the home as well. And that realization has been a long coming. And the web of culture change needs to widen to us. Domestic and sexual abuse champions in community centres and workplaces, just people who are trained a little bit to receive a complaint sympathetically and pass people on to help. Every training for such a champion is one more person understanding and being able to detect abuse. Trade unions, employers. We had a very good scheme starting in the Northeast. These can spread, and the churches. We were asked to do a pamphlet describing sexual and domestic abuse for the Catholic clergy and seeking to open congregational eyes to what it resembled. We were pleased to do it. Promoting culture change, targeting perpetrators, supporting victims. I have to tell you that for 30 years, women's voices have called for all of this, and many of you will have been part of this for a long time, as I have myself. But now, there just may be, because of this confluence of circumstances, a key change moment when we can shout again and shout with men to lead in the 180-degree cultural change that's needed to lead us out to what is rightly called an epidemic of violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. We're happy to take a few questions. Is that okay? Thank you. Do we have anybody that would like to ask Dame Vera a question? Oh, the hand right at the back. Oh. What we're going to do is we're going to bring the camera to the person who's asking the question. I may need to repeat the question so that you can all hear it, but then you'll be able to see who you're speaking to. Sorry, it's a bit...
It's fine. It's my fault for not being there.
Far away.
I can't hear you.
I have to come up. Right, sorry. I just can't hear you either, so sorry about that. We tried not to spend a lot of money on this, as you gather. Come up here for a sec. And there, and yeah, she's on this microphone. Okay.
As a woman in defence, I've always felt it's been a defence issue to kind of protect against women against violence. Would you agree with that? And how would we kind of make it a defence issue moving forward?
Are you talking about the defence industry?
The Ministry of Defence.
The Ministry of Defence. So I've just recently been put onto the Military Justice Board, which gives me the first foothold I've ever had into the Ministry of Defence. And I have to say, there is a long way to go in the military, I think, to bring about the culture change that we're all talking about. I think there's been some material out in the ether in recent days about gender discrimination in the military and about abuse and about, you know, a lack of places for women who are in that position to go to outside the chain of command, where their complaint can be taken seriously in what is obviously still a very male domain without jeopardizing their future or making matters worse. And I think the current Chief of the General Staff hasn't covered himself with glory by saying that the culture of the military, with its kind of male camaraderie, you know, it may just be that this is part and parcel of that. Well, I'm afraid that is not the case. Being sexist isn't part of being a soldier, doesn't qualify you very well for that at all. And women are, of course, in all frontline positions. So I haven't gone far into the Ministry of Defence for the questioner's a proper answer to me. It has not in the past, so far as I'm aware, have played a big role in tackling violence against women and girls. Even when it's described as being cross-government, I don't think it necessarily penetrates to all those corners. But here is a toehold. There are some people involved in the military justice system who are very pro-women, very sympathetic, and I believe that we can start to chisel a little bit of change, which might help there.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Would you like to come? I should be able to hear you. Just into that. Yeah. Oh.
Hello, thanks for coming to talk to us today. When someone is accused of rape, arrested, put on bail, and then several months later, the CPS say, we're not going to go ahead, we've changed our minds because it's your word against his, are they then put on a police list?
The complainant or the defendant, or both? Are you asking, which are you asking about?
are rapists put on a list, even though when the CPS say they're not going to go ahead?
Potential rapists.
The defendant.
Yeah, the
The
defendant.
yeah, the person accused. Sorry, just for clarity. Well, I don't know, but it is not impossible, because a lot of intelligence data is kept about a lot of things that we do, you know, and people who have been accused of things which they haven't been found guilty of might nonetheless be on a list of people who are suspected of having that kind of tendency. But the same goes, you know, for people like, you know, not like me, I have to say, but people like us who might have been in the supermarket, been mistaken, you know, as a thief, found out that that's not the case, but you might nonetheless find yourself on some intelligence list. So it is, you know, a very difficult piece of territory, because the police need all their intelligence, but it can you know, obviously disfavor people who shouldn't be there. But I think that the truth is, and all the reassurance I can give, is that it is no worse for rape cases than for any other kind of suspicion, which the police tend to note in case it helps with a future investigation.
Are there any more questions? Oh, yes. I don't think, well, she probably, yeah.
You mentioned the Criminal Justice Service. I lead services in Dorset, voluntary sector, and we have independent sexual violence advisors who support clients through that service. There's still a lot of ignorance around that very role, both in the general public and with CPS as well as criminal justice. How do you think we can improve awareness of that very specialist role, which may encourage more people to come forward and report and be supported through the Criminal Justice Service?
It's great to meet you, and I'm delighted that you're in charge in the way that you are. Independent sexual violence advisors are hugely important professionals who are commissioned usually by a local police and crime commissioner, but centrally funded, and their job is, if somebody makes an allegation of rape, whether it's in the criminal justice system or at large, but the questions directed to the criminal justice system, an ISVA, as they're called, will be attached to that person, and they will be their professional friend from start to finish. We did a survey about 8 months ago, in which we got responses from about 500 rape survivors, and overwhelmingly, it was 50% more likely that a person would go to court and would be able to give their evidence if they'd been helped by an ISVA than if they hadn't been helped by an ISVA. So they're a massive, important cohort of people. I think the trouble is, as you exactly say, the CPS don't seem to understand the professionalism of the ISVA and tend to think that it's like, you know, somebody's mum or their sister or something who is there, and don't take them as seriously as they ought to do. I mean, this is, you know, what we frequently find as women, isn't it? You know, the number of times I've gone as a barrister into a police station with a male solicitor and been thought to be his secretary is, you know, nobody's business.
I don't fancy his.
Yeah, quite. So, but so, you know, there definitely is a piece of learning. What I am even more worried about than that is that the judiciary don't seem to understand either what an ISVA is, and they also think it's just a sort of friendly supporter. So we have situations where a woman is going to give her evidence to the court on Monday, and she has had an ISVA supporting her probably for a year, or in terms of the backlog, maybe even 2 years now, side by side, dealing with everything that's followed from the rape as her friend, her professional friend, who can manage the public services with her. And then the day she arrives at court, if it's the wrong judge who doesn't understand what an ISVA is, they will not allow that ISVA to sit with the complainant whilst they testify. So at the most testing time, you know, the time that people have been losing sleep over for weeks and have dreaded, talking about awfully intimate, shameful things in a public venue, their best friend is whisked away because judges don't understand. Now, I've tried to investigate this because there are a lot of Crown courts in which the judges do support ISVAs and find them extremely valuable. And one's guesses that at some point in some court, Anne Isver in some way overstepped the mark, or appeared to do, and was accused perhaps of coaching the witness, or I don't know what. This is just speculation, but it comes from the judiciary themselves. And I think that a key thing for us to do is to introduce, you know, an absolute assurance of quality by just having some kind of qualification for an ISVA that nobody can argue with. I don't think it requires any more training. I think maybe it just requires ISVAs to join some kind of ISVA profession, so that then the judges have absolutely no way of declining to let a person be supported by an ISVA. I mean, it is something, I think. So we did, when I was the PCC in Northumbria, we had a observers project where we watched, we brought some members of the public in who were interested in observing trials. They sat in pairs and they watched purely rape trials, and they watched 30 of them over 18 months. And in the first couple of cases they saw, they came straight back to me and said, the ISVAs are not being allowed to sit with the victims. And one of the observers sitting in the public gallery, you know, watching with their questionnaire to fill in afterwards, chatted to somebody sitting beside her and found out that she was the complainant's ISVA. And the complainant was giving her evidence with a male usher as her only support, and the ISVA was sitting in the public gallery. So I went to the judge straight away, the local boss judge, the resident, and I said to him, look, ISVAs are not being helped to go into court to support their clients. And he said to me, what's an ISVA?
Oh.
So I told him what an ISVA was. He got the point, and they do get access in that court. But that's, you know, that just is part of the problem. So this not, you know, the criminal justice system isn't unkind deliberately. You know, it's just not that sufficiently well hooked into all of what's needed to support victims now that they recognize this essential thing. And so they can do massive damage by excluding an ISVA when they don't know what they're doing. So that's definitely something we've got our eyes on, and I've tried to draw it to the attention of the MOJ. It's a great point to raise, and thanks. More power to your elbow running those resources.
Thank you very much. Oh, would you like to come down? Yes. This last one. Yeah, this will be the last one, people. If you come sort of here, she'll be able to hear from here.
Hello, I'm a student in the sixth form, and I was wondering if you could give students and teachers any advice for how we can challenge and uproot that culture of sexism and unconscious bias that can still exist against women even today.
So the government has, to its credit, you know, in a slightly hesitant way, but over the past years, has introduced personal, sexual, and other education, which is intended, you know, not to talk about the birds and the bees particularly, though I think that's a key component, but to talk much more culturally about sexual relationships between people, to try not just to give, you know, some biological information, as, you know, you may, I don't know what yours was, I think mine was frogs, but I can't that far back. But, you know, it is intended now to be delivered in a way that, you know, reflects the need for equal information. I think your biggest enemy, if I may say so, as an obviously liberal and enlightened member of your sixth form, is probably online porn, because it is said, and you will know this better than I do, that the average age at which a boy looks at online porn these days is about 11. And if there is no satisfactory alternative explanation of what sex ought to be like and is at its more enjoyable if it's like, then of course they think that that's the model of it. And porn is invariably porn, unless you pick it differently, porn by men on women. And that, I think, is, you know, capable of being a very unpleasant way in which good quality training, which I think there's a determination to introduce, although I don't think it's universally there, can be undermined very, very readily. One does hear of girls who don't know, that sex is not intended to be a predatory and even painful experience, and boys who don't either. And also, an enormous amount of pressure on boys to have sex in that way, to show their masculinity, just as women, young girls, can feel under pressure to also, join what they think that their peers are doing. So it is an extremely difficult circle to break, but it's brilliant that somebody like you recognises the need. And we do, and there's an online harms bill coming into Parliament before very long. There are a couple of reports coming up about it now. And I hope that there may be some powerful material in that can help us get out of the dilemma as I see it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Vera. We're really grateful to you. We're going to hear the feedback from our workshop groups now. And if you like, we'll share with you the action plan that we bring from the day. And we're very grateful. We're sorry you're not here with us, but thank you very much for joining us. And we found that riveting. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed. Bye. I'll see you in person sometime soon, I hope.
Far away, I'll just...